Good morning or afternoon, boys and girls. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Humphrey is sitting beside me and hoping that we finish his book soon. We're going to do one chapter in this, and then the next video will have two chapters, the last two, because the last chapter is really short. All right. So we're jumping back into School Days According to Humphrey by Betty G. Burney. All right. Chapter 13, Brisbane versus Becker. Ooh, remember this about the classroom pet war. Good news, the Itos never suspected what I'd done. In fact, Mrs. Ito noticed that the clock was 10 minutes ahead of her watch, so she changed her watch. Mr. Ito did the same thing. Believe it or not, we got to school 5 minutes ahead of the bell. Harry was surprised, his mother was surprised, and Mrs. Brisbane was surprised. I was not. Mrs. Ito, Harry, it's great to see you here on time, Mrs. Brisbane said. Mrs. Ito looked a little embarrassed. Mrs. Brisbane, I know we got off to a bad start this year, Mrs. Ito told the teacher, but I'm really going to do my best to get Harry here on time every single day. That made Mrs. Brisbane happy. I was happy too. I just hope nobody ever changes the clock again, except for me. I couldn't wait until recess to tell Og about my adventures, but first something even more important was going on. The students started their new jobs as Brisbane buddies. Here's hoping my plan works, I told Og. Roland Rosie and Forgetful Phoebe went to work right away collecting the homework assignments. The two girls put their homeworks in first. Yes, Phoebe had actually remembered to do her homework. As I was hoping, she probably figured it would look bad for a homework collector to forget her own assignment. Thomas never went anywhere without his class log, which he wrote in a lot. Mrs. Brisbane kept helpful Holly hopping. Holly took attendance and carried the report to the office. Later, Mrs. Brisbane asked Holly to tidy up the little library in the back of the room and water the plants. I think Holly finally got to be as helpful as she wanted. Hurry Up Harry and Slow Down Simon made excellent door and line monitors. When it was time for recess, Simon opened the door and Harry led the students down the hall. He couldn't dawdle if he was first in line. Then Simon closed the door and made sure there were no stragglers at the end of the line, so there was no way for him to race ahead. Boys and girls, are you understanding Humphrey's plan now? After lunch, there was free time for Tall Paul and Small Paul to work on the bulletin board. This was the pair I was most interested in, since they've never actually talked to each other before. It was a little hard for me to see what they were doing. I was in my hamster ball while Mrs. Brisbane watched just Joey clean up my cage. Once she got him started, she moved over to Og's tank to teach Be Careful Kelsey how to take care of him. I hope she's careful with you, Og, I squeaked, knowing that Joey wouldn't be able to understand me. Boing, boing, Og twanged cheerfully. While Joey was working, he talked to me. I can't believe it, Humphrey. I got the best job of all. Good things hardly ever happen to me, he said. I'd never seen Joey so happy. As he put me back in my cage, he said, It's just like having Giggles back. I can hardly wait until you come home with me. Me either, I squeaked before I remembered Joey had that frisbee-catching dog. Then I climbed up to the top of my cage to get a better look at the two Pauls. They were taking down papers and old thumbtacks that were still on the bulletin board. Tall Paul handled the top part of the board while Small Paul handled the bottom part. They weren't talking to each other, but at least they were working together. Near the end of the day, Mrs. Brisbane called Holly up to her desk and told her that she was doing a wonderful job. I was thinking, Holly, being my assistant takes up a lot of time. Maybe it would make sense for Phoebe to be Rosie's assistant, she suggested. After all, they are homework collectors together. Helpful Holly looked relieved. I think that's a good idea, she said, if it's okay with Rosie. I'll ask her, Mrs. Brisbane said. Of course, when she asked Rosie, it was no problem. And when she had asked Phoebe to be Rosie's new assistant, Phoebe's face lit up. Yes, my evening rearranging the Brisbane Buddies cards was definitely paying off. And the worst class ever was looking a lot better. I was pretty pleased with myself for a while. But after school, something happened that shook me down to the very tips of my tiny little paws. Miss Becker paid a visit to room 26. I'd never actually seen Miss Becker before. She was a short woman with great big glasses that made her eyes look huge. Ooh, that kind of sounds like me. That might have been a little weird, but Miss Becker also had a great big smile that made me like her. I hope you don't mind, Sue, she said as she came in the room. My students are very anxious for us to get a classroom pet, but I've never really had one before. Mrs. Brisbane smiled. My class was very fond of Humphrey and Og last year. Oh, I know, that's all I hear. Humphrey this, Og that. That's just all they talk about, Miss Becker explained. But I don't know. I've never even had a pet as a child. Why don't you come over and meet them, Mrs. Brisbane suggested. My heart sank down to the bottom of my toes. Was Mrs. Brisbane really going to give one or both of us away? I wasn't interested in having a hamster last year either, Mrs. Brisbane said. I remember that well. Then Miss Mack brought Humphrey in while I was gone, she continued. He added a lot to the classroom, so when Angie Loomis needed to get Og out of her classroom, I was happy to take him. It's funny because sometimes I think they've actually become friends. What do you think, boys and girls? Sometimes Og and I are friends all of the time. But do you have to, touch them? Miss Becker said. Her big smile had disappeared. Sure I do, but I don't mind, she said. Miss Becker leaned in close to my cage, so close her eyes seemed gigantic. They say Humphrey does many cute things, she said, her voice quivering a little bit. Mrs. Brisbane chuckled. I should say so. Show her, Humphrey. I've never been shy about showing off my great gymnastic abilities. After all, it seems to please humans to watch me leaping, spinning, rolling, and climbing, and to hear me say, squeak, squeak, squeak. But I was a little nervous about showing off so much that Miss Becker would want to move me to room 18, especially since she didn't even want to touch me. But I always try to do what Mrs. Brisbane asked, so with a heavy heart, I hopped on my wheel and began to spin. Oh my, Mrs. Becker's big eyes grew even wider. He's certainly active. She didn't sound too pleased about that, so I decided to be a little more active. I jumped off the wheel and climbed up the tree branch as fast as my little legs could carry me. When I got to the top, I leaped onto the side of the cage. Miss Becker gasped. How does he do that? He's a very clever guy, Mrs. Brisbane said proudly. But Og is no slouch either, she said. I had a chance to catch my breath while the two teachers turned their attention to Og's tank. He's a very handsome frog, isn't he? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Now, I consider Og a very fine fellow. But handsome? With that green skin, no fur at all, the huge mouth and those big googly eyes, which suddenly reminded me a lot of Miss Becker's eyes. Boing, Og twanged. It was a pleasant sort of reply. But Miss Becker jumped back from the tank. What was that? She asked. That's the kind of sound he makes, Mrs. Brisbane said with a lot of patience. And what does he do? Miss Becker asked. He spends part of his time on the dry part of the tank and part of his time in the water, Mrs. Brisbane explained. Og must have been listening, With those ears I can't see. Because he suddenly leaped in the water and began splashing wildly. "Oh my," Miss Becker exclaimed. "He's awfully noisy, isn't he?" I'd had it then. We'd been very polite to Miss Becker, but she certainly wasn't so polite to us. "Not as noisy as you are," I squeaked. Miss Becker looked back and forth between Og and me. "How do you manage it all?" she asked. "Oh, the children do most of the work," Mrs. Brisbane said, "though I do enjoy bringing them home when I can. I think the point is something Ms. Mack told me when she brought Humphrey to room 26. You can learn a lot about yourself by taking care of other species. That's proved to be very true." Miss Becker stared at Og and me for a while before she spoke again. "I don't know what to say. The students love them so much." Just then Miss Mack came in. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked. "No, you're the perfect person to talk to," Mrs. Brisbane said. She was right. Miss Mack was a perfect person, at least to me. "Some of my old students are begging for a class pet, and Arlene's trying to decide whether to get one," Mrs. Brisbane explained. "So she's came to look at Humphrey and Og." Miss Mack smiled her wonderful warm smile, and any class would do better with those two. For once, I was sorry Miss Mack had come to visit. I didn't want her to talk Miss Becker into taking me away. "Thanks for your time, Sue," Miss Becker said. "I still have a lot to think about." After Miss Becker left, Miss Mack wanted to talk to Miss Brisbane. "It's great to see my students learning to read," she said, "but some of them are having a hard time, and I want them to see how much fun books can be." Mrs. Brisbane nodded. "That gives me an idea. We could work together." She glanced at the clock. "I've got to go now. I'll give you a call tonight and we'll talk." Just before Ms. Mack left, she bent down so she was eye level with my cage and Og's tank. "Maybe my students need a classroom pet too," she said. Suddenly, I had a sinking feeling that both Og and I would be leaving room 26. When Aldo came in to clean that night, it was clear right away that he was still upset. "Richie called and said he thinks one of you is coming to Mrs. Becker's class," he said. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Me either," I squeaked loudly. "Boing, boing, boing," Og agreed. "Of course, those kids love you," he said, calming down as he swept the floor. "But the new kids need you too." It was true. Just about everyone seemed to need a helpful hamster. Later that night, after Aldo left and Og was quiet, I slipped my little notebook out from its hiding place and started a couple of lists. Reasons to stay in room 26. Mrs. Brisbane relies on me. The new students have a lot of problems and need help. And to stay with Og, I hope. Next list. Reasons for me to move to room 18. To be with my old friends, Richie, Heidi, Gail, Kirk, Tabitha, and AJ. To teach Miss Becker about pets. Reasons for Og to move to room 18. To be with his old friends, Richie, Heidi, Gail, Kirk, Tabitha, AJ. To teach Miss Becker about pets. Those last two lists were the same. I stared at those lists for hours and hours and hours, but I couldn't decide which would be the best choice for me. In the end, I wouldn't make the decision anyway. But just before I tucked my notebook away for the night, I worked on a poem. Autumn, oh autumn, the golden leaves are blowing. Autumn, oh autumn, I don't know where I'm going. Humphrey's Rules of School. Make sure you do your part to make your classroom a better place. And boys and girls, I wish we were doing that right now and we were together, because all of you made our classroom a better place. Every single one of you had special gifts and talents and were kind and generous and made our room 16, not room 26, room 16, a great place to be. I miss you all so, so much, and I can't wait to actually see your faces, which will probably be after the summer. And so I'm going to say goodbye, and just a reminder, there's one more video. It will be chapter 14 and 15 together because they're both really short chapters, and we will finish School Days According to Humphrey. Aw, he loves his book and his pencil and his notebook. All right, have a beautiful, blessed, lomtastic day.